Okay, I'm going to lead our presentation through this. I think this is, in some ways, you could look at the title and you think that looks either challenging or dull, but one of the things that I've actually really enjoyed, particularly to work all my life I've been a professional scientist, but working together with Pascale to bring both of our different views on how we can address intellectual property and licensing to achieve the goals we want to in terms of pandemic preparedness. So although some of this might seem dry, the real focus is on how do we discover the right medicines and license the right medicines to get the outcomes that literally everybody wants to be better prepared for what will inevitably be the next viral crossover. But what we want to try and focus on is how do we create the legal and intellectual property tools to try and hold that back, preferably to be an outbreak, not an epidemic or a pandemic. So that is, I think it's really important just to think, since most of the people on this call are probably scientists, that is the goal of doing this. And just remember that all the way through. So Petter's introduced ourselves. So I'm a chemist, Pascale has a strong legal background, and it's our combined efforts, but a lot of this is key. So antiviral therapeutics obviously are just one component in trying to prevent future pandemics. But one of the things as we think about this more deeply is that we need frameworks to create those therapies. So there was an attempt during the early COVID moonshot to do compound repurposing, and it basically completely failed, with possibly the exception of some of the steroid work that worked quite well. But that was about treatment of people who were already terribly ill. If you actually want antivirals, we're going to have to discover them. And we demonstrated, so I worked in the COVID moonshot, we showed that open science can really do a good job in identifying preclinical candidates. And again, for COVID, what we all remember now is we had a horrible period and then the vaccines came and they rescued us. But actually, there are many viruses for whom vaccines don't come quickly. The obvious one you would identify would be HIV, where still there is no good vaccine. So it is not a guarantee that in any future pandemic, vaccines would come quickly. So we need to be able to have many different tools in the toolbox to treat future viral outbreaks. And one of the compounds that is used clinically, Cetrelvir, which is licensed for use in Japan, cites the open science data that came from the COVID moonshot as a contributor to that development. So having done the COVID moonshot, we wanted to look at how what was then a patent-free approach, what we were going to do next as we moved into the AViDD Center. And ASAP is focused currently on coronaviruses, picornaviruses, and flaviviruses, and we're trying to do broad spectrum. But this is really important, so let me get a laser pointer here. So the first thing, which I emphasized straight off, is the reason we want global, equitable, and affordable access is to avoid inequities, and which led to massive global deaths. And we want to get those antivirals to the places where they are needed first. The quicker you get them to the places they're needed first, the smaller you can contain a future epidemic. And also, we want to make sure that the science gets out into the open as quickly as possible, because no one group will do it all themselves. You want to put discoveries out there into the public domain. And I emphasize this: equitable and affordable access is not just an ethical approach, it's an operational need. So whatever your views on ethics are, holding back viruses early is something we need to do as humanity, because otherwise, we've seen what it does. Okay, I'm going to go back and talk a bit about the COVID moonshot. So COVID moonshot was a global open science initiative, came together organically in the very earliest days of the pandemic, and literally the sun never set on it. It worked, I was going to say feverishly, for 18 months to try and discover new compounds. And we deliberately aimed to do that as an open science initiative, so to have no patent protection, with a real focus on global equitable access. It's funded by the Wellcome Trust, COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator. I'm very grateful to the DNDi who work with the rest of us to help do that preclinical and phase 1 and at-risk phase 2/3 clinical development. So that's what we put in place early. And what did we learn from it? So we took the view that we were going to go with a patent-free, direct, open science, direct-to-generic approach. And in the research phase, that was phenomenally effective. We were able to rapidly recruit collaborators. We didn't even have material transfer agreements. We could just send them ideas, data, compounds. We didn't have any contract negotiations because it was just, well, this is all going out there. What we discovered later on was actually that slowed down some investment, because until they saw phase 2A data, without any patent protection, they viewed that as a bit of a challenge. And because you want to keep confidential chemical structures of the antivirals we discovered until clinical trials were initiative, it actually resulted in some of our best compounds being kept confidential longer than they would have been if we'd filed patents. And there was actually some delay in development funding because some philanthropic funders were uncomfortable with this patent-free approach. They didn't really know how to deal with it. It was outside their area of experience. They just wasn't something they were familiar with. So there were challenges in not patenting. But of course, if you do want to patent, there are also challenges. And again, one of the things I'm going to emphasize in this talk is none of this is easy or straightforward. All of it is difficult, but it is all worthwhile. So our argument is that if you want to hold viral threats early, outbreaks, not pandemic access, you want to have control over equitable access, that means you need licensing. Because otherwise, high-income countries will adopt defensive positions. They will either make sure all the antivirals are just held in those countries and they don't get to where you need them. Or, you know, there may well be profiteering in some cases. Again, problematic when you're actually trying to get antivirals to where they're needed first. And if you want to have licenses, then you need to have patents, because without patents, you can't make your licenses enforceable. So the drive all comes from our long-term goal. See, the only reason we're doing these things is because we want this. And that drives both maximally permissive licenses to get them everywhere and minimally defensive patents. So we don't take any more than we absolutely need to in terms of intellectual property. Okay, I'm going to have a brief sidebar here because I appreciate not everybody in this audience has been exposed to some of the procedure of patent filing. And there are some key terms that you just need to be aware of. This is not a detailed view of the entire patenting strategy, and patenting varies according to legal territories as to where you file and the exact details. So this is a very general overview of common terms. But some key common terms you need to know about are, you have an invention and it needs to be useful, it needs to be novel, and it needs to be exemplified. You can't just patent ideas, you have to show them reduced to practice and demonstrated and evidenced. They must be novel. So you can't just patent something that everybody knows. And that's basically what we describe as the prior art. And if you have all of these things, you may be able to file a patent application. Patents are applied for. After a period, they are then published. They may be challenged, because one of the challenges would be you're trying to patent something that already is known, or you're trying to patent something that is not useful, or there is insufficient exemplification. So just because a patent's been published, it doesn't mean it's been granted, but if a patent passes all its challenges, then it may be granted, and then you have the right to enforce that patent and to control who can't use your intellectual property, and then patents expire. And then an expired patent is just prior art. So those are some key terms for people to be aware of if you're not already. I apologize to those who are already completely up to speed with this. Okay, so what have we done in ASAP that's different? So the first thing is we operate under NIH intellectual property rules because we're an NIH-funded center. So the inventorship and ownership is determined under United States laws and NIH rules. And rights and obligations of joint owners is subject to the country's laws on patent and IP ownership, which do differ substantially. So if you didn't have a policy in a center, then actually joint IP owners aren't able to do much for us because we are an international group. So the IP policy we have created, and I'll come on to where you can download our IP policy and use it because we've open sourced that. So we would welcome people to actually take a copy of our IP policy, peruse it, modify it, make it better, stick it back in the public domain. This is an open agreement. So all the members of ASAP have signed up to the policy, and that allows us to define what we are doing together and set terms applicable to all institutions, such as who owns it, who prosecutes patent rights, where the costs, and we've tried to erase any potential financial benefits because that's not what we're doing, but who can grant licenses and the terms under which the licenses are granted. So that requirement to create licensing means we have to have a policy within the center so that everybody is signed up to the same thing. Okay, and we're talking now about what our patents are. So often when you work either in a large company or a small company or an academic institution, there is a very strong drive to file, basically patent all your inventions. And ASAP's not doing that. Okay, we have a strong open science approach for the reasons I've already talked about. So although there are a huge number of innovations going on within our teams, in algorithms, in assays, biological techniques, synthesis, all of that, everything we do is innovative, but it's out of scope, even of our policy. There then is chemical matter. Now, if it's active in other diseases, it's just chemical matter. We are disclosing it immediately. Again, we're really not interested in generating any intellectual property here. And then it winds all the way back. So the only compounds we are really interested in generating intellectual property for are just our shortlist. So that's the shortlist of compounds that we want to put forward into preclinical development. Now, around it, we have to delay the disclosure of compounds near our shortlist so that these compounds cannot be inferred. So this is everything we do in the huge egg, but all we're really interested in is the key compounds. And what that does is means we can negotiate access to them. So when we hopefully get these patents granted, then we can talk to our development partners and say, well, if you want to exploit this intellectual property, these are the terms. It protects our ASAP candidates from third-party IP predatory activities as well. And of course, we have to disclose exactly how the compounds are made, what the structures are. The ownership is based on inventorship. The scopes are very restricted. And I'm going to give you a worked example that is not compounds we're interested at all. It's an imaginary example, but it makes it more clear. And the patent costs are borne by the applicants. There is no expectation that we get any money from this because we have had grants to do the work. Should there be any revenues under bizarre circumstances, then we divide that amongst all members. But as I have said, we've almost enforced the fact it's very hard for us to make any profit. That's not our motivation here. And then the other side of this is now you've got a patent, what kind of licenses are we going to aim for? So all of these points are key. So we are prioritizing non-exclusive, royalty-free and global licenses. That drives pricing down and enables key antivirals to be broadly distributed. We do not want exclusive rights over regulatory data market. And some people think that's a way of doing it. We're in some ways being a bit more traditional in adopting a patent plus licensing approach. One of the advantages of that is, of course, people understand this. This is an established IP legal framework in a sense. We're not creating anything really new. We're evolving existing methods to apply them to the pandemic preparedness situation, which we argue has potential. There are obligations potentially placed on our development partners to sublicense the medicines patent pool or another equivalent mechanism, again, so we can make our antivirals available as broadly, as quickly as possible. Now, it might be possible that we would need to engage a downstream development partner, and so you could allow, within our agreement, exclusive licensing for high-income countries only, but again, with limits. Approval of our members, non-exclusive licensing in low and middle-income countries. Just because of the way that many of the diseases we are interested in or believe are the highest risk, we have to ensure this. And we want to have transparent and affordable pricing in high-income countries, because, of course, just because a country is high income, not of all the people who live in it clearly are. So affordability of antivirals is another key factor. And it's not just about licensing. We have to think about actually the implementation of these licenses. So it's not enough to say that this is licensed for use in low and middle income countries, but we have to make sure the actual physical antivirals get there. So we can talk about reservation of manufacture until the approval of multiple producers. So all of this is designed, right, as I said at the beginning, to put the antivirals in the place where they can contain disease the most effectively. Okay, I'll keep going. So this is just a graphic of how that might play out. So we work currently in discovery and preclinical space. So ideally, we can go either down the royalty-free, non-exclusive license to a development partner, or we work with the development and commercialization partners, and that can end up in low and middle income countries as generics and high income countries as generics, but ideally with non-exclusive manufacturing, potentially through MPP or the WHO. There is a limited amount of this that may be necessary. So that's the preferred licensing scenario. There are alternatives where we end up with time-limited, royalty-free, exclusive licenses. Again, as I've said, that's this arm. Again, non-exclusivity drives down pricing. So that's where we really want to end up, because this is our priority. Okay, so we need a common interest approach. And I think this is another thing that is worth considering, is that bluntly, we weren't well prepared for the SARS-CoV-2 driven pandemic. And although the first inhibitors to market, nirmatrelvir and encetravir, were discovered in about ridiculously quickly. I mean, this was outstanding work. The only way we can go quicker is to already have compounds phase 2 trial ready at the start of a pandemic. It's like when you run a race. The best way to win a 400-meter race is to be 4 meters from the end or 10 meters from the end. You've just got to go further before the pandemic breaks out. But investing in preparing for future pandemics is hard. So, we can ask the question, well, would governments and philanthropic organizations fund pharma to conduct pandemic preparation research? And under what conditions? Conversely, if we are going to use public funds to actually fund antiviral research, doesn't that imply we should all have, because I suspect the majority of people on this call are taxpayers in one territory or another. If it's our taxpayers' money being put to good use, don't we all want global equitable access in exchange? And fundamentally, the business model for doing pandemic research is really difficult because you don't know when, if ever, you're going to get a return. And I've worked all my career in purely the commercial sphere. And it's very hard to see how there's a good business model for doing this unless you can somehow construct a way of being paid, people being paid to do the research just to do it. In which case, if they're being paid, they've not taken any risk. If they're just being paid to do research, they don't need an extra return. So pandemic threats are completely agnostic to who you are, where you are, or what you earn. They are common threats to all of us. And the free market hasn't really delivered pandemic preparedness medications. So we need to do something in common. And there's a philosophical argument that these antiviral medications are actually common interest objects. They are different to other medications just because of these problems of you don't know when you're ever going to use it, but when you do, you all need it, and you need it in the right place. And this point, if you discover it through common endeavor, it should be distributed for common benefit. Seems like a fair swap because it's all about what we want to do, achieve clinically in the end. Whoops. Okay. I'm now going to actually take a little bit of a dive into patenting practicalities, because as we've been doing this, there are some kind of key points that you start to discover, because everything looks good in the abstract, but there are some key questions that we get asked. So what data did you release when? There's the concept of, in intellectual property law, of obvious to a person skilled in the art. So that means not only can't you disclose the exact compounds that you are planning on disclosing, but you need to, if any of the compounds you do put into the public domain before you file your patent, make the next step, quote, obvious to a person skilled in the art, you don't want to put those in either, because you will derail your patent application. And then there's a bit of detail here. When you file a patent, all of your scope needs to be searchable with one structure. So do you file one patent with a narrow scope, but searchable with one structure, or a single compound patent? Now, this seems really esoteric. So this is why I'm going to show you a real-life example, or an imaginary example, but with real compounds in it. So this is imaginary data. We are not filing this. I have no interest in this. I drew these chemical structures as example structures. But this is what you might see on the front of a, for want of a better term, a classic broad spectrum patent application. So here's a chemical structure with a core. It has, these could be halogens, these could be small alkyl groups. You need an acid here of some kind. Now that's the SAR you might know. And again, remember, everything in our world is going to end up in the public domain eventually. So everything you know gets there once the patent publishes. It's just a question of what do we publish first. But let's imagine that actually our shortlist of compounds is this. So it falls within this bigger definition. So the halo is fluorine, the small alkyl or cycloalkyl might be isobutyl, or say cyclopropyl methyl, so just put a bond across here. And of the different acids you could have, for some reason, it turns out that you want to have a sulfonamide. And it's actually only 3 sulfonamides that you want to use. So this is our shortlist. This is our marquoosh. So what are we going to actually file? So this is now a very narrow version of this. So this, you could imagine, might have between hundreds and thousands of possible compounds in it. But instead of filing this big patent, what we're actually going to do is the narrowest patent that we can conceive of that covers our shortlist. So instead of here, instead of any alkyl or cycloalkyl, I've just said exactly the compounds we care about. Here, there are 3 sulfonamides I care about, so I just have these listed here. In total, that claims 6 compounds because it's just 2 times 3. That's everything that's claimed. And our shortlist we put in as examples with 3 compounds. So we've tried to make it absolutely as specific as we can get. So having understood those 3 steps, the question then is, so what do we publish? What do we put out as open science before this patent publishes? So we might identify the best alkyl groups. So we could publish lots of alkyl, lots of cyclyl, and from that, a reader might be taught that you can work out which the best of these groups is. We could publish the activity and perhaps stability of acids and acid heterocycles. Again, the reader will infer that acids and acidic heterocycles are very useful. We haven't published sulfonamides at all, though, or acyl sulfonamides rather, and that means that you can't then infer the combination of best alkyl, cycloalkyl, and best sulfonamide, which is what we want to publish. So fundamentally, this is harder than just publishing this alone as our patent late on, or even keeping everything completely secret until this patent publishes. It is more difficult to do, it is more work, and you have to think about it very carefully. But if we want to meet our goals of open science to enable others and narrow filing, this is the position we end up in of having to do extra work, but it's feasible. Okay. I'm just going to emphasize, because we are not patenting for the sake of patenting. We are patenting to enable licensing, and we are licensing to enable the right access. So that's the whole drive, really. The last slide I have is we've actually, sometimes the medium is the message. So we've published all of our thinking in this area in an open science journal. So because we're partly funded by the Wellcome Trust, we thought it appropriate to publish through Wellcome Open Science. Not only can you read all of this, download it, you can download what the reviewers thought of it as well. And some of the comments I've made are actually addressing some of the points that the reviewers highlighted on. If you're interested in how the policy works in real life, if you want to consider this as a possibility for teams that you work in, you can download actually our entire policy, and it's got a, I think it's got a open source license on it. So you are free to use our policy as well, and that's made available through Zenodo. So you can actually take either of these DOIs and download them and follow up.